watching LYNC Interview. I'm Jessica Eturralde. In this episode, we're diving into a thought-provoking conversation about the intersection of business and social impact. Joining us is Dr. Eva Witesman, a leading expert in pro-social business and social impact from Brigham Young University's Marriott School of Business. Before we get started, here's a little reminder that we depend on viewers like you to spread the word. So if you enjoy this program, please like and subscribe and share this program with someone you know. Dr. Eva Witesman is a professor at Brigham Young University's Marriott School of Business, specializing in public management. She teaches in both the Master of Public Administration and Master of Business Administration programs and serves as the director of the Ballard Center for Social Impact. Her research focuses on nonprofit sector theory, pro-social business, and public values, with numerous publications and presentations in these areas. In July 2023, Dr. Witesman was appointed as the director of the Ballard Center for Social Impact, where she continues to advance social impact initiatives. Dr. Witesman is also a recent recipient of the Earth Secretariat's Freedom of Religious Belief Corporate Leadership Award. Welcome, Dr. Witesman.
Thank you.
As we explore the role business plays on the global stage, particularly in promoting religious freedom, Dr. Witesman, can you share what religious freedom means in relation to corporations?
Yeah, so I think there are a couple of ways that we can really think about that. One of the more immediate ways that I think that corporations can engage the idea of religious freedom is within their own business. And we're definitely seeing a trend where companies are thinking about the religious freedom of especially their employees and the ways that their employees can express their whole selves at work. So that I think is one way to think about it. You can also sort of extend out to other stakeholder groups like customers or people who witness advertisements or engage externally with the company. And you can think about ways that representation really matters and representing aspects of religious life can be really empowering to people when they see it coming through a corporate context. It's sort of just validating of that part of human life. But the other aspect that I'm not sure that we give enough attention to is that corporations are also actors in the public space and they engage in similar ways to civil society. They create engagement among people. And so in many ways they can be thought of similar to ways that we might think of a government or a non-governmental organization in that they bring their own values and influence to the marketplace and can really shape the conversation that the public is having about religious freedom, about religious expression. And so that's one of the spaces that I think is really untapped and really exciting and interesting.
That is exciting and interesting because, and I think we've talked about this before a little aside from this particular interview, is that I think sometimes the general public has a tendency to not think of corporations as being as invested.
Yeah, I think there's been, and I think it's especially about the last half century or so, this idea that businesses only care about money, that they don't care about people, that they don't carry values, and that they aren't really players in the public space, and that that's a role only for individuals or only for government or nonprofits. And I think that's a real mistake. Corporations do, in fact, have and propagate values. Sometimes those are profit maximizing values. That is certainly among the things that corporations think about, right? Um, and I think sometimes we separate that from sort of a pro social orientation. And really, those things are linked. When a corporation is thinking about maximizing profits, they're also thinking about maximizing return to their shareholders. They're thinking about protecting the investments of the people whose retirement futures are invested in their companies. And they're trying to do the best they can by those people. But that's only one set among many stakeholders. And companies increasingly are thinking about all of those stakeholders. In 2019, the CEO Roundtable actually put out a statement that said, look, business is not just about maximizing return to shareholders, we actually care about the well being of other stakeholders as well, current as well as future. And I think it's that conversation where the idea of religious freedom fits in to this larger narrative about what business is and what business does. I mean, if you think about it, people spend about a third of their day engaged with their own workplace and a huge fraction of the rest of their day engaging with other companies and corporations. This is a very public space and it has huge influence and impact on the lives of people and the expression that people have. And so, if we recognize that role of both business and markets in this social space and recognize them as a social space, all of a sudden, everything that we think of as relevant to any other social space is relevant in business and important to the business and to the relationship between businesses and their many stakeholders. So it's that conversation where religious freedom, religious expression, religious pluralism, even things like freedom from, sort of the idea of a state religion. I think that same concept of like freedom from sort of religious oversight, all of those conversations become really relevant to business and to markets.
Yeah, thank you for sharing a little bit about just the potential for businesses relating to their stakeholders and just the opportunity between developing their relationship in this space. So, given your expertise in both business and civil society, how do you think these two domains can collaborate more effectively to address challenges, particularly fostering religious freedom and social cohesion?
Yeah. So I think religious freedom and social cohesion are really related. And I think one of the ways that they're related is through the idea of pluralism, the idea that we exist in spaces with people who have different ideas and different values from us. And civil society is really good about thinking about how you reconcile between majority views and minority views, how you work in a pluralistic society. So, governments, for example, are built in part to think about that. Some governments sort of go to one side and say, we want everyone to have the same set of beliefs. We don't like pluralism, right? I think those are in the minority. And I think the larger global trend is toward pluralism and diversity and understanding that we have many different interests and we need to have different ways of representing those. So your question is sort of about how can we work together across civil society and business to think about religious pluralism, to think about religious freedom. And I think it's that same concept of values in general and reconciling those. In governments, we might have legislatures, for example, or democratic processes that help us to reconcile different values and bring those to the table and think about how we might set policy in acknowledgement of that diversity. In NGOs or nonprofit organizations, you might have similar processes. You might have collaboration among different groups or among different individuals to bring some value to pass. I think we assign a lot of like value holding in society to NGOs, but that happens in governments as well. And one of the ways that I want us to think about cross sector collaboration is to recognize that businesses engage in this space as well. In fact, if you think about markets where you've got people who are bringing things to sell or trade and others who are purchasing them, that's actually a values expression. When I bring something to market and I talk about it, I'm expressing values and preferences and hopes for the world that I'm trying to build. If I'm an ideal business, I'm actually solving people's problems or offering to do that by offering products and services that fit into people's lives in a way that makes their lives better in some way that they value. So, on the other side, when you've got consumers who are purchasing or consuming those products and services, that too is a value expression. That is an exchange of values where I might choose this company over that company because my needs or my values or the things that I value align more with company or product A than company or product B. So I want us, first of all, not to sort of excuse business from being engaged in this pluralistic value space, because in many ways, the market is like the biggest venue for expressing values and for managing pluralism. The way that we manage pluralism in markets is through individual choice. I get to choose what I sell, others get to choose what they purchase. And in doing that, they express their values and create their own best life. So, the first thing that I think is necessary for this cross sector collaboration and understanding is recognizing that it's not just corporate social responsibility or corporate philanthropy where corporations are engaged in value based decision making and value based action. It's the entire business, and it's every interaction with every stakeholder where these values are being expressed. So, the first thing I think that's necessary is just recognizing that even though it's a different mechanism for value expression, it's still a value expression. So that I think sets a framework for conversations and saying, well, how do we protect, for example, certain values in this pluralistic space, including religious values or the desire to be free of religiously derived values? Like in a pluralistic space, you have both of those. And so understanding that there are needs in this broader society to create a pluralistic space where we can have conversations about the values that we hold for our religious expression of values, for our deeply held beliefs, for our view of what a better life or a better world might look like, that is so often shaped by faith and religion. I think that conversation can be opened by understanding these different mechanisms. A lot of times, I think we narrow business and its engagement in pro social, peace building kinds of spaces to the money that they have. Uh, and we look for grants, we look for philanthropic donations, and we sort of do that same reduction of business to a valueless moneymaker. And I think engaging earlier in conversations with business leaders who are human people who have their own values and interests, who represent sometimes dozens, sometimes thousands of people in the decisions that they make, engaging them and saying, here are the challenges or issues or policies that we're thinking about, and exploring ways that business and markets can bring value to those conversations, I think is an important piece of this larger conversation.
Yes, I've heard you say before that businesses have a lot more to contribute than just their money. And listening to what you have to say now, could you provide an example of ways businesses can contribute just beyond what they can provide financially?
Yeah. So, one of the things that kind of makes me chuckle sometimes is when governments, and this can happen at like the local, state, or federal level within the US, it also happens internationally, especially in emerging economies, is you'll listen to civil society sector folks talking about economic development and how what they want to do is create these flourishing markets that attract businesses, and that those businesses will come in and provide opportunities for people to work. And by working, they'll be able to sustain their families and build healthy lives and build healthy societies and contribute to their faith communities and other philanthropic efforts, and just kind of build these thriving communities. And yet, often in these conversations, they're not actually identifying specific businesses that could offer those things and recruiting those specific businesses. So I do see that happen often at the local level in some jurisdictions, especially in the United States, where you might have people working in government, for example, who are negotiating with business owners or with corporations with the intent of bringing in specific types of business. And that negotiation includes conversations around what kinds of regulations would create a healthy market in that location. What kind of lifestyle do people want to have? How walkable do they want their city to be? What kind of industry do they want to have in what kind of areas of the city? What kind of jobs do they want to have for the people who are working in that city? And so that conversation where you're actually negotiating with business leaders happens around this idea of economic development and shaping the social environment of a city. That conversation can include things like what kinds of values are held in this community? Is this a diverse community? Do we want it to be more diverse? Do we want there to be more conversation among different faiths within this community? And you might think of that as being like a conversation that needs to happen among church leaders. And certainly they're going to have those conversations. But business leaders also create space and they engage in the creation of the space and the market and the conversation. They create the environment for the people who work for them, which shapes the environment in which people are living in a city. So if I work for a large corporation that's based in my town and is where maybe 50% of the people in my town work because it's it's a large factory maybe, right? And a lot of people are working there. The day-to-day experience in that corporation, the way that that corporation expresses values, including how it celebrates religious holidays or doesn't, how it has conversations about tolerance or doesn't, is going to shape the entire community, not just that company. And so those conversations need to happen early. They need to happen as we're thinking about the kind of place we want to build and who we want to build it with. And on the other side, companies can think about, oh, how can I contribute in this place with these people? What holidays do they celebrate? What kind of tensions exist in the community that I'm now doing business in that I can help to reduce, right? How do I engage as a public space, as a social space where I can be an active facilitator of these conversations, both in the community and within the walls of my business in a way that allows people to grow and allows us to intentionally create the kind of society that we want to build together.
Insightful. So you spoke a lot about the value and the roles of business in a community. So my next question would be, what steps can civil society take to engage the corporate world in this type of conversation effectively?
Yeah, I think the first thing that needs to happen is less demonization. So I think that it's almost even in the training of some, not necessarily civil servants, but mostly like folks in the nonprofit space, where there's this belief that like part of the reason that we exist in the nonprofit space is because business is failing in really specific ways. And there's some economic theories that sort of suggest that markets do fail in really predictable ways, but that doesn't mean that business is evil, that it's trying to break things, that it's trying to break society. It's just that there are certain institutions that are better for certain kinds of value exchange and other institutions that are better at other kinds of value exchange. And we have to find the way that those institutions work together. So I think the first thing that we can do is just not demonize business.
Right. And can I just stop you for a moment? Could you define what you mean by the interpretation of businesses failing?
Yeah. So um, I would sort of refer specifically to concepts around market failure. And there are a couple of different ways to think about that. One way to think about that is that a market fails when desirable goods or services, so things that people want to have happen in society, just aren't profitable in a way that incentivizes businesses to create those goods or services. So, one common example of that would be what we call public goods. These are things where if you produce one unit of whatever that good is, everyone benefits. And so there's no incentive for other people to pay for it. Examples that are often given for this are things like national defense. If I provide national defense to one person, it essentially means I'm providing national defense to everyone. And because it's not individualized, like I can't prevent you from benefiting from our national military, for example. And so that means that we are less incentivized to voluntarily pay for that. And so those are the kinds of goods and services that get shifted to other sectors, like the public sector, where now, in order to pay for the national defense, we use things like taxes. And so instead of people exchanging for national defense in a market, we have taxes to make sure that everyone's paying their fair share of this benefit that we all receive. So that's one of several types. There are other types. Most of them have to do with whether or not, if I pay for something, I am the sole consumer of it. And so we often think of businesses as being engaged in the work of providing private goods, and they are less good at providing collective goods or public goods just because it's hard to get people to pay for those. And so, in an economic sense, that's a failure to provide certain products or services that there's demand for, or where pricing is inefficient. But there's this other way of thinking about failure. And one way, there's a scholar by the name of Barry Bozeman who wrote a book called Public Value Failure. And he says you can have perfectly efficient markets and not have the social outcomes that you want. And so he's moving it away from economics, which is how we traditionally talk about market failure. And he's moving it into sort of this social space and saying, look, you can have great markets that are really good at monetizing things and making profit and having incentive to build things. But the result of that might actually be harmful for people or not producing enough good for people. And so that's a second way that we think about failure in kind of this business space. And I think sometimes those two get conflated a little bit, and we sort of, because we've pigeonholed business only as a profit center and not as a value center, even though they are naturally social spaces and they are naturally value centers. But we think of them only in profit centric ways. And that's been the trend since about the 1960s or 70s. When we shift it that way, we sort of absolve business of doing its part in this economy of values, when really it is the institution most immediately situated to touch the maximum number of lives. We interact with the market far more than we interact with nonprofit organizations or even government. On a day to day basis, what's on your mind is more likely to be related to a business than it is government or nonprofit, unless you work at a government or nonprofit, right? And so I think that's one of the first shifts that needs to happen so that we can usefully have these conversations is stop sort of excusing business from this role that it very naturally carries in influencing the values and lives of people. And so that shift allows us then to invite business leaders to the table, just like we might invite NGOs or government leaders to the table. And some of that is going to be jurisdiction specific, right? If you think about large nations that have thousands upon thousands of companies, it becomes really confusing about who you bring to the table. In a smaller community, it's a little more obvious who might be influencing the culture of the community. and who might be having an influence on expressions of religious freedom or who could have influence there on having pluralistic values. Um, but the same is really true of like nonprofits and NGOs too. You have tons of those that are operating in any national context. But once you focus on a specific question, it narrows, right? And there are very specific actors who are working in that space or could be working in that space. So I think the shifts that need to happen are, first of all, not demonizing business and recognizing that businesses carry values and can and should do that. And the second is to not reduce businesses just to a profit center, to the money that they make, because that shoves them more into that corner of not needing to think about the ways that they either contribute or don't contribute to social well-being, including religious freedom, including religious pluralism, including having thoughtful conversations about the ways that people engage in their communities and in their personal lives and with each other in peaceful ways. So if we can make those two shifts, think about businesses as more than just their money, right? And engage them as voices and not demonizing business and assuming that it has the worst social interests at heart, but recognizing that at their core, what they want to do is actually solve human problems because that's what makes people want to engage with them. Those two shifts, I think, are essential in having this conversation across sectors moving forward.
Oh, right. And you bring up some really strong points. And I think I'm just so glad that we're having this conversation today in this interview because it seems to me that there are some significant gaps in education and understanding about the identity of businesses and their potential roles in civil society and their contribution. And it seems also that corporations are often seen as faceless entities, somewhat
Right,
focused on exploitation or
right.
self interest. And during the Berlin Civil Society program, you spoke on the corporate panel, and you argued that it is not necessarily true that these businesses, corporations are faceless entities focused on exploitation, but you highlighted the moral factor as a strong motivation for corporate engagement. Could you share some specific examples where this moral factor has successfully driven corporate involvement?
Yeah. Well, and I'm going to go ahead and jump into like some really a little bit heavy but also really complex spaces here as we talk about this because I want people to understand that this isn't just black or white and that there's learning going on in businesses just like there is in government and NGOs. So, when businesses engage in what we would think of as exploitation, essentially what they're trying to do is create efficient markets where they're paying for goods or services in the market at sort of the perfect point. So, they want to get value that they can then convert by combining pieces of value or adding something to it or branding, or there are all kinds of things they do to add additional value to sell back out and receive more than what they spent, right? So at the core of that is the idea that businesses should be adding some kind of value. For example, they might take raw materials and then through human or robot labor, create a product that didn't exist before that meets a human need that they can then sell. And when they sell it, it needs to cover the cost, not only of the raw materials, but also of the labor that it took to create it, and enough to then provide some profit back to the shareholders who have invested their money in the hopes of making a return to secure, for example, their retirement. So there's value that's happening at many levels here. There's the payment that you're making for the raw materials and for the human labor. There's the product you're creating that creates benefit to someone's life. There's the profit that you make that creates a stable safety net for people who now use that money to secure their retirement, especially in older age when they aren't necessarily in a position to be able to work to pay for their livelihood. So there are many levels of value that businesses are creating along this value chain. So, when we talk about exploitation, one of the things that we're often talking about is things that are happening down kind of at the beginning of that value chain, where a company is going to be trying to minimize the amount of money that they're spending on the raw materials and on the labor. And so, sometimes what that means is that the labor in particular is not being compensated at what people feel like is the appropriate value. So one of the challenges is if you overpay at that point, you can mess up markets in ways that erode communities. Um, and yet you need to pay enough that people who are giving their life for this can buy what they need in terms of food and clothing and shelter and things that bring them joy, right? So there are these balances. So I told you I was going to get like a little heavy for a second. So let's take an example of child labor, which in some countries is legal. And so if you have a company that chooses to engage in contracts with people who are willing to have their kids go to work for the company, then all of a sudden this company is engaged in child labor. And it may be that the corporation is just buying products that are being exported from a country, and that country happens to have smaller companies that are working inside of it that are hiring kids to do the labor to create things that they're selling to these larger corporations. So corporations don't always know that this is going on. Increasingly, obviously, we all expect them to know what's going on in their whole supply chain. And so increasingly, that's expected. So the natural response you would have to something like this is if you feel like the value that you hold is that children should be sort of engaged in education and play and development instead of labor for pay, then you might, as a corporate executive, say, we are no longer going to do business with that jurisdiction or with those companies within that jurisdiction that are using child labor. Totally rational, totally reasonable, value-based response. And in fact, many companies are making that choice. Here's where it gets complicated. The reason that children are working in these jurisdictions is because their families need the money for their own sustenance. They can't make ends meet just with the adults in the community working. And there are a variety of reasons that that might be true when we're dealing with emerging economies where extreme poverty can be the norm. Work for pay among all members of the family is one way that families keep themselves out of poverty. When those job opportunities that are in part funded by corporations, the purchase of that labor through corporations or their subsidiaries or whatever, when that's withdrawn as a work opportunity, the demand for the money still exists. And the most likely way to get money is still through the work of those family members. And so, what ends up happening in some of these communities is that if the children can't be engaged in sort of corporate labor, they end up being engaged in human trafficking instead. And that isn't always or automatically the next thing that happens, but it's happened enough that this is a clear pattern. So just withdrawing and saying, that's bad, we're setting a value there and we're not going to allow that anymore. And so we're withdrawing can actually cause more harm than good. This is where corporations can step up as global citizens and they can say, we acknowledge that this child labor is happening in this community, and we understand that the underlying reason for that is poverty. What can we do to create more of the world that we hope for as we engage in this process? If you just increase pay, that does interesting things to the economy that isn't actually solving the root problem and isn't helping to solve, for example, the need for education or for additional types of work available to the people in those communities. So, in some cases, what you'll see is you'll have corporations who invest heavily in a community. They build infrastructure for people. This improves sanitation. Sometimes they'll build and fund schools, which improves the education and provides an opportunity for children to go to school. This increases the opportunities, even for that same corporation, to hire back these students who are now more highly educated and can provide a different type of value that is worth more money to the corporation. And so, this is the kind of investment that I don't think we're talking about enough. Sometimes I think we think about, okay, well, corporations can like donate grants or whatever, but they also naturally build infrastructure when they're engaged in business. They build factories, they build roads, they operate all kinds of things that we might normally associate with government or NGOs. And they do this because they also want a stable, happy workforce that provides value to the company in a way that they can shape and repackage that adds additional value for their customers and their shareholders. So I think the way that we often think about these kinds of issues, especially in like peace building and international negotiations and trying to take different groups whose views are so fundamentally different, in part because of culture, and that's often rooted in religious beliefs and faith. That's part of this conversation. How are these communities operating and why are they operating that way? Those conversations have everything to do with faith and religion and culture and society. And businesses have a huge influence on the direction and future of those communities. They need to be culturally sensitive, they need to be religiously aware, they need to be thinking about the conflict or potential for conflict that exists among different communities within a region. And they have a tremendous amount of power through their own supply chains and their own stakeholders to have these conversations and build infrastructure in a really powerful way that's far from just throwing money at something or funding an NGO or paying taxes to the local government. They build things and they invest in people and places in ways that shape them. And if we think about it too simplistically, that shaping can be incredibly harmful. So, if civil society through NGOs and government engage business in this conversation, we can move so much further, so much faster with so many fewer mistakes based on these same values that we all share. For example, that we would like young human beings to be able to develop and grow joyfully and in a way that's resourced so that they can become contributing members of society in a society that is increasingly lifting itself out of poverty. Businesses are run by people who care about that same stuff. But the simplistic answers that we often think of are completely detached from the business reality and even the social reality of people because we're oversimplifying things by demonizing business or not thinking deeply enough about the role that they play in society and what that means about the influence that they can have in bringing peace and stability to regions all around the world.
Right. And you, wow, you really talk about some heavy things. And I appreciate you um, discussing the nuances, the complexities of the problems. It's not black and white. And before you had talked about this, I too did not understand the ripple effects in just the details of what throwing what we might think is the solution, simplistically using your words, how that would or would not work. You mentioned something that civil society can engage businesses more. You also mentioned that this conversation is not being held enough. How do we have more of this conversation? Where do we start?
Yeah. So I think there are a couple of venues that are really natural for this. So anytime you're gathering any group of people to talk about a region, and a lot of times religious freedom conversations are based on specific regions where you may experience religious conflict, and those tensions run high. It's natural to want to bring in the religious leaders because, if we can broker a peace between the religious leaders, they can share that conversation with the people that they lead. It's natural to bring in NGOs that we sort of automatically think about being engaged in the work of peace and peacemaking and peace building and stability. And it's natural to bring in governments whose policies and discourse really shape that public landscape. If you're in a conversation like that with those entities and there aren't the relevant business leaders in that conversation, that is an immediate opportunity. And what you're going to look for is the business leaders of influence. So, people who are employing a lot of the people on one side or the other of a conflict. In some cases, folks on both sides, right? So, you want to think about who the employers are. You might also want to think about who are prominent business leaders that might be affiliated with one group or the other. These figures, these business leaders have tremendous influence on many stakeholder groups. And so engaging them in those conversations and working with them to find language and practices that can matter for a specific community is an automatic venue for sort of changing this dynamic a little bit. I think another venue is in schools, business schools, academic conferences, any place where you are educating the next generation of business leaders about what it means to be a business leader, what it means to engage in global business or even local business. What kind of social influence are you having? What kind of influence are you having on your stakeholders? What kind of influence are you having on future generations? These conversations are increasingly happening in business schools, but we need to accelerate that. And I think we can do that by engaging with faculty like myself, right? And having conversations, inspiring one another about what's possible, looking for practices that are happening already on the ground, exemplars, writing cases, practicing teaching those cases so that we can get more people thinking this way faster. So I think that's another really important venue. And then I think there are, at the global level, there are lots of entities that sort of gather groups of similar people. So you might think about like business leaders in the global compact, right? And so this is business leaders talking to business leaders. And then you have other entities or organizations where you've got likes talking with likes, government leaders talking with government leaders, NGO leaders talking with NGO leaders. And there's absolutely a space for that. It's an important thing that needs to happen. Um, but we also need to be having carefully crafted conversations where we're bringing those groups together with the same problems that we might talk about in our separate conversations. We may all be talking about the same thing, but from our own perspective and not having that conversation together. And so creating intentionally intersector entities where our conferences and conversations and roundtables are cutting across those sectors and always including business at that table is going to have a ripple effect. Because when those business leaders who are having that conversation with folks in other sectors and they're understanding each other, when they go back to their separate corners, they're more informed and they can see more opportunities. And they can also share that information in a language that makes sense to them, right? The business leaders can come back and talk about sustainable development and religious freedom in new ways that then spreads among those groups. So I think that's another opportunity that we have is to create very intentionally intersector conversations in addition to the stuff that sort of naturally happens where we're gathering likes with likes.
It's interesting what you said about certain pockets of groups having these conversations, but it's within their pockets, so to speak.
Yeah.
And just the importance of branching out in this multi-sector conversation opportunity and what we can learn by doing that. I really appreciate that. And I enjoy having our conversations. It's always a joy to talk with you, to listen and glean from you, Dr. Weitzman. And one of the things that's notable is that you seem to always be passionate and very interested in this conversation. And it makes it very inspiring and driving and uh, to think about ways that we can have conversations, but have effective conversations that can move forward. And I'm just curious to know what drives your passion for encouraging businesses to take on a greater role in peace building and fostering social cohesion.
So it was actually a bit of a conversion process. So I taught in the MPA public administration program before I taught in the business administration program. And my training is all in government and nonprofit. And so when I talk about the training that we receive that sort of demonizes business, that really was my training. We began at the idea that markets fail. Governments and nonprofits have to sort of pick up the pieces. We're the guardians of public value. And those are really important professional ideals for me in the public administration space as I work with the nonprofits and NGOs and governments. That guardianship matters, right? And so a lot of my passion has sort of always been there for like wanting to protect the public and the public interest and to create societies that are beautiful and good and sustainable. Um, our public administration program at Brigham Young University is housed within the business school, which is a little more common in Europe than it is in the US, but in general, not the normal model. Like, usually, public administration programs are either in their own colleges or they're more closely affiliated with like political science, which is sort of the field that public administration grew out of. And so being in a business school was sort of a unique opportunity to rub shoulders with people who were thinking deeply about business. And at Brigham Young University, we're a religiously affiliated church. So our sponsoring institution is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter day Saints. And because of that faith foundation, my business colleagues here were very much framing everything they do in that same value of loving their neighbor and serving one another and using business as a tool for good. And that was a real paradigm shift for me over time. And there are actually like a couple of like really arresting moments in my professional life where my whole paradigm got turned upside down. And I began to understand that markets, the reason that we're so upset when they fail is because in many ways they are actually the primary institution that we trust to be a guardian of public values. And there are some like very specific economic models like utility theory that explains exactly how that's going to work. That if you go back to Adam Smith, he talks about how the wealth of nations is measured in part by how we treat the poorest among us. And that the beauty of markets is that by pursuing our own individual personal interest, we somehow create wealth and stability for our entire society. So somehow learning that like markets were a big and powerful institution that we weren't even including in the public value conversation was just completely novel to me and so exciting because markets are everywhere, right? Markets and trade and uh, sort of this self-reliant idea of being able to create something that didn't exist before you took raw materials and created something new, and that something could be of value to someone else in a way that makes both of you better off is like magic. So seeing that disconnect, but also seeing the potential of sort of sharing that message with more people just was so exciting. And so it lights me up. It takes all of that like public interest and public value and love of society and wanting to elevate lives, and empowers it with sort of this new institution that isn't new at all. It's old and functional and powerful and amazing. And the very roots and foundations, like the philosophical and theoretical foundations of how and why we do this and why we protect and support markets, is all rooted in the same values that I had in government and nonprofit. So that's where that passion comes from. It's like excitement about, oh my goodness, it's been in front of us this whole time. And we got distracted thinking about profit maximization and saving pennies. And we've developed this language that doesn't even resonate with public value. Like some of the stuff I was talking about with supply chains, like in the business world, you would call it de risking your supply chain. If that's not the most like business jargon, value free phrasing you've ever heard, I don't know what is. But what they're basically saying is we want to make sure that the people in our supply chain are okay and healthy, because when they're not, it erodes our whole vision for what we're trying to do, right? De risking the supply chain sounds so profit centric. But there's value underlying that, right? Because our stakeholders care, our customers care that we're taking good care of humans. And because they care, and because our shareholders care, we all care. I mean, we may naturally care anyway, right? Also. But this language is like we've gotten practiced at like reducing business to just this moneymaker, and that money is somehow valueless. It's not. And there's beauty in business that I don't think we're teaching. And if we did, I think more people would be inspired like I was. And I think we'd be able to move a lot further, a lot faster in some of the goals that we have for building stability and peace around the world and reducing some of the conflict that is the result of societies that aren't using all the tools at their disposal to build and create peace and prosperity.
Well, market value and its contribution to public value, a paradigm shift from Dr. Weitzman. Thank you for sharing that. And I think our audience will learn so much in viewing and hearing this today because I think there, just like you said, there's a lot of conversation that isn't being had very much. And I think it's just uh, you sparking this conversation and extending what you learned, giving us even a pinhole insight. It begins to become clear, at least at the foundational level. It's just like you said, the amazing thing to you was that this has been in front of our face this whole time. And when you mention it, it seems so obvious. And yet, like you said, we've been distracted with other things. So thank you for sharing that.
That's my pleasure.
Absolutely. I know we're getting close to time, and I like to wrap up this interview by asking, is there a question that you were hoping that I would ask or something that you find that it's important to convey that you haven't gotten to yet?
I think we've covered a lot of ground, and I really appreciate your very thoughtful questions in helping us get there. I want to make sure that the connection is clear between sort of this general social responsibility of businesses and the idea of like creating value in businesses. I want to make sure that it's really connected to these ideas of religious pluralism and religious freedom and how all of that connects. So when we think about things like poverty, and we think about hunger and the suffering that comes from families and societies that just don't have enough right now. One of the main drivers of that is conflict. There are other drivers too. Climate change certainly changes farming patterns, and that has huge influence. But even that can be overcome if we have people at peace. So, human conflict is one of the greatest contributors to certainly global hunger, but also poverty. when you think about human displacement and refugees and the need to sort of start over with nothing, a lot of that is happening as a result of war and conflict. That war and conflict itself is often rooted in not just cultural or political differences, but in religiously rooted ideologies that come into conflict through their expression in societies and cultures and governments. So, at its core, this idea of religious tolerance and religious pluralism is essential for reducing human conflict in a way that ultimately reduces poverty and increases stability in ways that allow people to build the infrastructure they need to build and create value and engage in markets and trade, which ultimately is the source of wealth. That's the way to sustainably do it. Donations, that's not a sustainable way to help people live their best lives. We need healthy markets to be able to do that. And so I think markets show up on both sides of human conflict. They show up before human conflict as a potential peace building tool. If businesses take seriously the role in society of building not only financial wealth and stability, which reduces the need for human conflict, but also religious tolerance and pluralism, which allows people not only to build wealth, but also to build peace in a way that reduces conflict. If we've got them engaged before these conflicts happen in maintaining religious pluralism and maintaining peace and establishing wealth and well being, we're going to be in a much better position. On the other side, post conflict, if you're in a position where you've got people who have been displaced, the core thing that they need to rebuild their lives is going to be work. It's going to be work for pay. And that's how they're going to be able to establish homes, and through homes, societies. And through those societies, expressions of faith, expressions of other human values that matter to them, creation of societies. And so business has a role on that side too, post conflict. And so I just want to make sure that we've come full circle with how all of this high level, business and markets and wealth and supply chains, like how all of that connects back to religious pluralism being an important value for businesses to both embrace and to bring to the world. And they can do that inside their companies by helping to broker peace among their employees, among their different stakeholders, to validate that part of human life and existence, but also as entities, as representatives of these mini societies where they can engage and create and promote peace and stability in communities as well, not just with their own employees, like NGOs do, like governments do. So I just wanted to make sure we'd come full circle with that full topic and connect that whole stream of thought. Like, how does religious freedom in business connect with the peace building role of business? And how does that help elevate our human family?
Thank you for reiterating on the value of religious pluralism in this space. Thank you, Dr. Witesman, for sharing your expertise and recommendations today. We've explored the ways corporations can advance religious freedom, foster social cohesion, and contribute to global peace-building efforts. And your expertise shows us that businesses aren't just economic drivers, but they're also moral actors capable of profound impact when aligned with civil society and shared values.
Thank you for the opportunity. It's always so fun to talk with you.
And thank you all for watching. And don't forget to continue these important conversations in your own communities. Until next time, take care and stay engaged. I'm Jessica Eturralde, and you've been watching LYNC Interview. For more information on religious freedom building, including reports, stories, case studies, and programs like these for video and radio, visit lyncommunity.com.